Hey everybody, it's Jeff from Programmer vs. World, and today we're finally going to keep going on our Sling tutorial. I know it's been a long time. There's been a lot of things going on behind the scenes, and in between work and health and some other things I had to take care of. The end of the year in 2016 was awful, right down to the election, so I'm just happy to get all that over with. And starting fresh in January, I do have plans to keep the tutorials going. Thank you guys for being patient. I'm also going to try to make them a lot smaller. They're a lot easier for me to record that way, and they're a lot easier for me to actually get them done and get them uploaded if I keep them sort of short. So I'm going to try to keep them to 15, 20 minutes at a time. In this specific tutorial in part 2, we're going to go back on our original tutorial and we're going to organize the page using HTL templates, and then we're going to turn around and get a phone call right in the middle of our recording. Let me mute that. Then we're going to turn around and we're going to take our original HTML, and I told you that we were going to write the code that allows us to see all the child nodes underneath podcasts. So we're going to create a renderer that's going to list all the podcasts on our podcast page, and that'll probably be enough that it'll wrap up in about 15 minutes. So let's take a quick glance at where we were when we actually stopped. We basically just had a single renderer that all it was going to do is render the actual podcasts section, and when we refresh that, we can see that all we get is this is the podcast list. All right, no, really, this is the podcast listing, and we got that because we had a HTL template in here that just was going to put a header for the title and description in, and for our node, whoops, I had to reset my computer all the way from scratch again too, guys, so this was a fresh install. Basically, we would go into our content for our podcast directory, and we had this description that said, no, really, this is the podcast listing, which is showing here, and this is the podcast list, which is showing up top. So that's exactly what we said to do. If you remember, because I know it's been a while, our static directories actually had a copy of Bootstrap in it, and jQuery, which is just like standard procedure that we would snap in place if we were creating a real quick app. So let's go and actually look at the code for our application right here. So before we go too far in depth with making this page larger and larger, we need to know that we can actually break this up and do like we would in a real development environment, so to speak, where we would try to extrapolate the header and put it in its own place, and then we would turn around and actually take the footer and put it in its own place. Well, HTL is kind of interesting in the way that it does that. It's sort of like server-side includes, but sort of not. HTL will only inject things inside of tags, which means if we want to actually take the header and extrapolate it into its own template, what we have to do is basically inject this part of the actual code inside the header. And I'll show you how we'll actually do this. This is a lot easier than it used to be in Sling. It used to be a real pain in the butt. What you would have to do before is you would actually have to create a content node for the header and footer, then create renderers for the header and footer, and then you could include it using JSP tags inside of your actual document, or using ESP or JSP tags. HTL has made this a lot easier. So what we can essentially do is right here in the top level of our components, we can create a new file. And I'm a little bit rusty here because I've been out of it for a while, but let's call it header.html, and we'll just put it here. And we'll come into our podcasts section right here, and we'll just take just these lines, and I'm going to cut it right out, and I'm going to put it right here in my header. Sorry, I gotta straighten that up with my OCD here, and I'll just save it. So now all we really have to do is find a way to inject all of that back into the head tag again. And in order to do that, we're actually going to use some of our HTL code. Let me straighten this up. So the way we do that is Sightly has all these specific data attributes that are designed to be injected into the actual HTML nodes themselves. That's the way the renderer knows that something special is going to happen. So anytime you see an attribute start with like data-sightly, you can almost guess that there's some form of sightly template injection going on. Most people are used to this already. I know that like Knockout and Ember and a lot of others work off of actual injected attributes. But in this case, we want to use one called include. And Sightly uses an interesting template caveat where it'll use this, a syntax that looks like this. All right, meaning it's not much different than the way, I guess, well, PowerShell is a little bit different in the way it basically everything inside quotes grabs your attention and says, hey, anything that follows inside here is specific data object that's going to get injected into, that's going to be argued into the Sightly template engine. Anyway, so we can go right here and we can just give it a full path. Let's do it from the root. Say apps, components. Whoops, I got to spell it right. Once again, I'm back on my tiny keyboard. God. There we go. And we called it what? Header.html. And that's really all there is to it. Now, if we save this away, and I'm pretty sure I saved the other one, right? We shouldn't see any change, even though I know it had to have changed, right? Because this is no longer there. So let's go in and modify our header. And we'll add a little bit more to it. And then refresh it. And we can see right here that it actually did change. So that quickly, we've actually extrapolated out our header and been able to do it in sort of a Sightly type include. Now we could do the footer the same way. The problem is right now we really don't have a footer. But it's really a lot more fun if we got onto the beef of things. So Sightly also renders data the exact same way. For instance, if we were to put a div tag here, which we'll actually do here in a minute, and we would change this code at the end of it, we can actually inject new things into the code, and that includes all the child nodes that are sitting underneath our top node. But before we do that, let's stop for a minute and have a look at what's actually in here. You remember before in the podcast directory, we actually created two children. We created a podcast here and a podcast here. Didn't really do a whole lot with them though, did we? No, we didn't even give them names. No, we'll do that in a second. Anyway, so we know we have two child nodes underneath here. And what we really want to do is actually render those guys out to the front to make this thing actually do something. So we can use the same principle here as saying we want to use data Sightly, except at the end of it, what we want to do is say list. And list is a way that we can actually create a basically a for each loop inside here out of something that we inject in or argue into it right here. So argue into our list, we're going to use the keyword resource, which is actually a variable that's exposed to the template. Resource is the current JCR resource that you're on. I don't know the level at which most of you guys have operated in Sling before, but there is a set of variables that's usually always exposed through JavaScript, through the scripting engine, that allows you to actually pick them up and operate on the JCR or on Sling itself directly from the code. And we'll look at these in just a moment. We'll say list children. Okay, and what this will do is this will actually create a list object, which will actually be called item for us, and it'll list all the children that's underneath that resource node. Real fast, let's actually stop and do it real quick. I usually find it by searching for Sling scripting variables, right? And I think it may be on this Confluence page, actually. Right. We can see here that on the actual Apache Sling, you can't see me pointing at the screen, can you? That's funny that I do that. On the actual Apache Sling Confluence site, they actually list out all the normal ones that are included every single time. Regardless of the template engine you're working on, you will always get these common ones. And notice resources right there, which means it always gives you the current resource that you're on inside the JCR. You could also use Sling and do some crazy stuff with it as well from inside the scripting things. But the biggest ones that we usually use are like request in order to get the query parameters out of it, and resource in order to get the children. There's some other stuff you could also do as well. Here it'll state, like if you're using JSP, you have all of these, which we're not using it. We're using Sightly. If you're using ESP scripting, you get your own set, and if you're using Groovy or Groovy server pages, you get your own set. To be honest with you, the most commonly used ones are resource and node, or current node, and that is just if you guys have seen that before, that's just really two different ways of working with the JCR. Node is the more Jackrabbit-esque way of doing it. It's the way we would do it if we were writing code directly against Jackrabbit. Resource is more of the Sling way of dealing with it. They're actually both in two different APIs too, if you ever want to search around and look for them. Well, basically what we've said now though is for every single child, all right, we created a list, and inside this div we're going to iterate through it each individual time. For fun, what could we do? We could just say, let's just put the item. Whoops, I do that all the time. Let's just put the item name inside a paragraph tag. I don't know that that space is actually syntactically correct, but I do it all the time. It's force of habit. Probably a bad habit, to be honest with you. So we notice now that when we refresh our page, we actually get podcast 2 and podcast 1 actually being iterated underneath it now. And that's pretty much because they actually exist. Let me open up a new tab. Actually, I'll just reuse this one. And that's because they exist underneath here. And this field here is their actual name. So what I said was, hey, just display your name underneath here each time, and they actually did. The interesting part of this is that template does not look very good. Let's change this class real fast. Let's change it to list group. Isn't that what it is? Didn't do a whole lot. I'll have to troubleshoot that later. For some reason, that whole bootstrap template doesn't look. I know the font's correct, so it must be. I may need to put a container or wrapper around it so we can see it better. Anyway, so let's go ahead and add some code in here. First of all, I really want to put like we need to use basically a title and a description, don't we? So let's real quick, and I'll continue to butcher those tabs. If those of you have never used the little tiny Mac keyboard that comes with the iMac, it's where the braces are and everything else is like completely alien after you spend a lot of time working with bigger keyboards that like work. And remember, these two were very common tags. They exist pretty much on every single node, whether you fill them out or not. So we're going to go into our podcast and we're actually going to fill these things out. We'll probably make it up as we go along. And you'll notice we get nothing now. They're actually there, but we have no title and no description for each one of the podcasts. So let's go into our content. And for podcast number 1, we'll say JCR title equal and we'll add a description, if I can spell it right, DSCRPTON. Alright, number one is about nothing in particular. Alright. GCR title, GCR root must be followed with a character. Oh yeah. That was not very smart of me. I know you guys caught that and we're screaming at your screen right there. Description. All right. So let's go back and see what I jacked up. DES. Yeah, here it is. Description. One day I'm going to set. There we go. So now we have a podcast and a description showing up each individual time. Let's go ahead and what we'll just do is we'll just for the sake of brevity, we'll come in here and reuse these again. This time we'll just change them to 2. I really wish I hadn't put the number 1 in there that many times after doing that. And then refresh, and now we'll see them both listed underneath. What is going wrong with our template though? So if we look at this and we wanted to sort of bootstrapify it here, this would be a list group item heading, wouldn't it? List group item heading, and then this guy right here would be list group item text. Let's see if that changes anything directly. Sort of. And then we would have this big ahref around everything, which we don't really know what we're doing yet. And this would be, class would be list group item. And I'm pretty sure that goes around the whole thing. And that's like the bootstrappy way of doing it. There we go. Hey, and look at that. All right, so now we have both podcasts listed. The interesting part is they're upside down, and that is most likely because they're listed that way in order. Check that out. We'll work on sort and some other stuff. Putting numbers. Typically, what happens here is you don't end up putting numbers at the end of these. And we haven't created the code yet to insert these so that people can fill out forms. Normally, the name is just sort of a canonical version of maybe the title or something that makes it unique. And it, to be honest with you, it really doesn't have to be unique, because if you enter it into the JCR with the same exact name, it's just going to put a number at the end of it for you. So there's really no way to mess this up when it comes to posting content. But it's really important to understand that everything listed in here is in the order it was inserted. My guess is for some reason, when I just clicked the refresh button or to load this project back in a Sling because I was building it from scratch, it loaded it in inverse order. We'll deal with it for now. Just understand that there's just technically no sort by or any way to change these. They're usually always going to be listed in the order that they were put when you do it this way. If we want to start adding sorting routines and the other stuff, we're getting into advanced templating, and maybe we will. We may get there. Trying to do this 15 minutes at a time, who knows how long this is going to take. Anyway, so right now they probably don't do anything, right? What we want to have happen here is when we click on each one of them, we want it to actually navigate into that specific URL and go like podcast 2 if we clicked on podcast 2, right? And we want to have it say .html, and we should get a rendering error, right? We don't have one, and that's perfectly fine for now. But for each one of those, we want, so when we click on it, it's going to go to its own top level node, and then we'll create a renderer for it. So basically, we'll start to feel the flow of, so if we create a renderer for every single node, Sling takes care of everything else. All we have to do is navigate back and forth, and we now have a working site, at least as far as read-only or display-only is concerned. So in order to make the links work, we got to change our href around. And in order to do that, we can basically take, like, the item name. We know that that's what the link is going to be called, right? And let's just look at what will end up happening. Now when we click on it, we end up going to the item's name. Cool. So all we have to do now, oh, actually that directory is wrong. Check that out. So it took it literally as going to the item's name. So what we really need to do is prepend something onto the item name in order to make it work. And we're not going to use plus or string concatenation or anything to do it. Sightly gives us a way. This at means actually we're going to execute a function against it, and we just use one that they already have called prepend path, right? And in this case, we can actually say, I want you to prepend the word podcasts in front of it. Okay. Now when we click on it, we see that we get, at least we get podcast / podcast 2, so we know the prepend's working. Now we just got to figure out how to actually get the HTML onto the end of it, and the way we do that is through another function that's possible inside Sightly called add selector. I think it's called add selectors or selectors. I think it is. All right, and then inside here, it's gonna. I'm sorry, that's going to be an array. It's going to ask us all the different selectors we want to apply. So in this case, we'll say HTML, and what ends up happening is now when we click on it, we get our render message that we actually went to our actual podcast. Now, remember each one of these, did we actually give them a renderer? I don't think we did. When we designed the content, we didn't actually create this line right here, Sling resource type. So let's go ahead and do that now. And what I want to do is on each one of these podcasts, and normally you will do this when you create your insert routine or your form that posts, you'll have it hide this specific key in here, Sling resource type. And we're going to do it here. Actually, I'll just copy this one and put it over there. And the reason I'm going to do that is when we do the next lesson and we create the renderer for those individual podcasts, we'll now be able to see them show up. Now what I want is when I click on this, I actually see the resource type here, meaning is if we built that template today, it would actually work, and this would actually do something. And that's pretty much as far as I want it to go today. So what we've basically learned is that using Sightly templating and I don't know what I'm clicking on here, and navigating each one of the nodes, it's possible for us now to list all the child nodes underneath the renderer that we had, and we can also cut this apart and sort of modularize each section of our HTML file as we go along to actually exist in other templates so that we don't have to have it all cluttered up. This, believe it or not, by an AEM or Sling standard is incredibly easy to read. When you get into some larger projects, especially in Adobe CQ and AEM, you'll see where people have used ESP and JSP tags like just overabundantly. It makes things really, really hard to clean up. That's why from the get-go, I want to show you guys the Sightly templating engine and how really easy it is to make everything work. I know I've showed this in a previous episode. It's probably, maybe they have a link in here. So they've changed the name of it to, oh great, I didn't even know this, guys. I'm sitting here working for the first time trying to find a page now that doesn't exist. So Apache has changed the name of Sightly to the Sling HTL scripting engine. And okay, I'm assuming if I click on that, I'll get a link to the page. There we go. Okay, so yeah, there's the new URL for that. Docs, adobe.com/doxy. All right, so it's called the HTL scripting language. Adobe has a habit of doing this. I guess Sightly was not. They didn't want to keep using that branding. Anyway, there is excellent documentation on this. It looks like they've moved it around a little bit on all the different functions that can be called inside there, like use and list and the other thing, along with some of the global objects that you could actually get access to. Remember, there's resource right there. So there's the actual URL for it. I'm going to put this URL underneath this video so that you guys can all have it. And did I have any other URLs that I needed to put underneath there? I don't think so. I think this is the only one. So I'm going to put this underneath the video so that you guys have it. You got to bookmark it. This templating language has made this 1,000 times easier. These tutorials are just going to fly as I do them. So that's pretty much it for it today, guys. That's as far as I'm going to go with it. In the next installment, basically I want to finish putting in all the pages for all the subsidiaries. Like when you click on it and see what a podcast is, we'll keep these very, very simple. And then I'll turn around and show you how to create a form to post to Sling to put the nodes in. And then we'll create, in another tutorial, we'll create a way to delete them out. And then we've basically got all of our CRUD operations. And we can move on to other cool stuff like actually generating the feed where we'll use an OSGI bundle. We'll play around with some other aspects of it. And that's where I have plans for it to go. Now, if you guys want to get like where we currently are out of source control, Programmer vs. World does have a GitHub page. There's very little things on it, but I'm starting to migrate all the stuff I had from a previous location to this. On this specific tutorial, you'll notice I'm using a Docker for Sling now. I don't even have it installed on my local machine. If you guys would like to go to Docker Hub, if you're on Linux, it's kind of confusing right now. If you're on Linux or Mac and you're using Dockers, this is all the stuff I'm migrating. You'll find that there is a Docker Hub out there. It's called Plasma Trout / Apache Sling Java 8. That's the one I'm currently using here on the Mac. This is my old GitHub repository, and I'm slowly moving stuff over. But if you also search for like Windows Server, if you're on a Windows machine, core, I think it's just called Sling, you'll find that we already have one right here as well too. This Programmers vs. World / Windows Server Core Sling, if you're into using Dockers, this is a Windows Server Core Apache Sling version for when I'm at work and I'm actually working on a Windows Server 2016 workstation, and I'm supposed to be doing my real job, but instead I'm actually working on Sling projects with other people that are usually open source. This is what I'm using. And then Programmer GitHub, right? So GitHub does have, I do have a few things here. I have the original Docker file used to build that. The Sling tutorial is actually here as I'm working on it, and there's a different branch for each part. So the part we completed today would actually be under part 2. Because these are Sling projects and Eclipse, they are incredibly hard to keep under control and source control. So probably the easiest thing to do is clone or download it, overwrite it in your workspace, and then refresh it. That's the easiest way to get it. But if you ever need to go back to where we were in the beginning, you can actually use the master. I will slowly start migrating stuff over from here and to here for this channel. As right now, I really don't have a whole lot, and that's because I'm actually underneath my Plasma Trout GitHub repository, which is where I was a part of way too many projects to actually keep track of everything. So I'll put the link to the GitHub, to both Dockers, and to Sightly in the bottom of this video and get you guys started. And this is kind of the way I'm going to continue for the rest of the year. I'm going to work almost completely off of Dockers. I may even preload. If we get to a part where the tutorial is getting really complicated, I'll just preload the tutorial into Docker and give you guys a link for where it is, and we can just all be on the same starting point. But for today, and I don't even know what the date is, January 26th, that's 2017. That's it for me, and I am out of here, and let me process this video. You guys have a good one.